is my honour to welcome you to St Michael's. Many familiar faces, of course, and many visitors. You are all extremely welcome this evening, and it's just great to have you here. My name is Eliza. I'm a member of this congregation, and I get the delightful job this evening of introducing Māmari and just taking us through the night's events. Before we get to do the fun stuff, I need to do the mandatory banalities. So the bathrooms are up in the hall, should you need one. And in the event of an earthquake, very unlikely of course, just drop and hold on to these sturdy pews which have survived many earthquakes and should give you comfort. And then hold on for further instructions. Could you also please just take a moment to make sure that your personal surveillance devices are on silent? Tonight's talk is the final in our spring series, and it's been quite thrilling to me to see these fascinating and important topics brought to life by experts here in our own church. Admittedly, I've mostly been on childcare duties and watching from a virtual distance, but it still has been a thrill. So we had, the first up, we had Phil Fountain, our own Phil Fountain, speaking to us about Christians who voted for Trump and really addressing the corruption of the Christian faith. Again, our own Ben Thurkel-White shared with us the personal impact of capitalism, and he invited us to consider how it shapes us and gets right inside us. Welcome, come in, grab a seat. Bishop Ellie gave us really a downright poetic synthesis of faith, Christian faith and feminism. And Stephen Hartley shared with us how emergent properties are one way that we can ask how the divine relates to our human, our biological and our physical levels of existence. And just a fortnight ago, Neil Dodgson talked to us about AI and showed us why and how we need to engage with the values that are going to shape AI as AI shapes our future. So it has been, I think, powerful stuff and important stuff. It's been scintillating stuff. And that is why we're here again tonight, isn't it? To use our brains as we shape our hearts and how we live in the world. To Māmari. Māmari is going to speak for about 45 minutes for us this evening, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. And Māmari is a member of our congregation, a much loved and very hard-working member of our congregation. She is of Te Rarawa and Ngāti Pākehā descent, and she is wife to Maynard, who's also here with us this evening, and mother to 3 children who aren't. And she's a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law at what we're still, I think, calling Victoria University of Wellington. Māmari is involved in research into feminism and Māori perspectives in law. And when I asked her if there was anything in particular that I should say when I introduced her, she did point me to her academic profile, but she said, perhaps the less said about that, the better. So I will just say that when I mentioned to a colleague at Wellington College today that I would be at this event this evening, and I mentioned that Māmari Stephens would be speaking, she just said, wow. And Māmari is going to speak to us this evening on Māori, Missionaries and Māori Christianity. And she said she is going to expand our understanding of what it means to be Māori and Christian. So thank you very much, Māmari, and welcome. Let's give her a hand.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Pukinamu tētahi o ku maunga, ko Wanui te awa, ko Ngāti Moetonga me te rohe kā o ku hapu, ko Wanui hoki te marae. He uri tēnei no te Rarawa, ki te toko o tōku pāpā, engari ki te tā o tōku māma no Ngāti Pākehā ahau, ngā reira. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora. So, yeah, Māmari is my name, and I'm in danger of overflowing with stuff that I want to say, so I'm hoping to corral the stuff that I want to say, none of which is original, all of which is stolen from other people, but I want to corral that in a way that makes sense for us when we talk to ourselves about what it means to be a Māori Christian in today's society, but also where we've come from, as well as what we mean by Māori and missionaries and Māori Christians. So I want to explore these words a little bit, if you like. But what I want to start with, and I will come back to locating myself in this narrative a little bit further on down the track towards the end of our kōrero. But I want to start with this picture. Can anyone tell me what that is? Is anyone familiar with this phenomenon? It's in the far north.
Yep, it's the two oceans.
Yeah, that's right. Ngā moana e rua, the two oceans, right? So it's right up the top of Cape Reinga, where you stand and you look down and you have the Pacific Ocean on your right and the Tasman Sea on your left, and the waters swirl and merge and something new is created. And I thought that this is a really, for me, it's an apt analogy of what we're trying to grasp tonight. These two tides of history that come together, these two peoples that kind of come together and wrestle and fight. But in the end, underpinning all that is God. And I wanted to read this quote to you because I thought this was an interesting illustration of it. In 1834, the Reverend W.G. Paki from the CMS walked to the Cape from Kaitaia, so a little bit of a hoof, and he was so impressed by this sight that he said the following. Well, he was kind of impressed, but he didn't quite get out of it what I get out of it when I stand there and I see these two tides clashing. The scenery around the place I stood was most uninviting. And not only so, but calculated to fill the soul with horror. The place has a most barren appearance, while the numerous sea fowl screaming and the sea roaring in the pride of its might, dashing against the dismal black rocks, would suggest to the reflecting mind that it must have been the dreary aspect of the place which led the New Zealanders to choose such a situation as this for their hell. Because this is the point at Cape Reinga that's also known as Te Rerenga Wairua. This is the point at which our dead, the spirits of our dead, leap and then return to Hawaii in the traditional kōrero. So that's what he's referring to, the kind of the idea of the underworld there. That's not what I see. And maybe those of you who've stood in that place too, maybe that's not what you see, but to me that seems like we're missing each other somehow. We'll return to that thinking shortly. Well, we'll return to some of that anyway. We tend to fall into two camps. The reason I wanted to emphasise this notion of the two oceans was we do tend to fall into two camps when we think about Māori Christianity or Māori and Christianity in New Zealand. And some of this material I take from Reverend Hirenika, Dr. Reverend, is it Reverend Doctor? Reverend Dr. Hirenika in his 2014 thesis. So in the one camp we have the notion that Mātauranga Māori, Tikanga Māori, Māori social organisation was to some large degree fatally impacted by the arrival of Christianity and the missionaries. There was no difference between the project of empire and the church. These things and the Gospels, these things are conflated in this thinking. The aim is the destruction of the Māori way of life to some degree, which was achieved, and the creation of something new that was recognisable to the English mind. So Camp 2, so there's this notion of kind of fatal impact, if you like, but also accepting that there was political resistance and and that movements were as much about rejecting government as rejecting the church, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. A slight variation of that, or perhaps even an addendum to that, is the idea of Māori as passive victims of missionaries, as passive victims of the arrival of Christianity. Camp 2, Māori were agents. That's true, that Māori had a degree of agency, but their use of Christianity from tribe to tribe was instrumental. So somewhat abstracted from the intellectual and spiritual thinking of Christianity. Instead, the missionaries were a resource to be exploited. When Marsden arrived in 1814, he was accompanied by Ruatara, who is an example of perhaps that kind of thinking. Ruatara was an innovator who wanted to see agricultural development, who wanted to see all kinds of tools and literacy being brought to Māori. So his thinking in accompanying and making the way easier for Samuel Marsden and Kendall et al. Was instrumental to a large degree. So there's truth in both of those camps somewhere, but perhaps not the whole truth. And I'm not pretending that we're going to get to the whole truth tonight because I've only got like another 35 minutes. I also want to show you this. This was released in May this year, the Faith and Belief Survey, where 1,007 New Zealanders were surveyed about their beliefs and their faith, funnily enough, because that's what the title says. And I want you to just take a moment and read that. I'll read it out for you in case you can't see the writing. In the census, Statistics New Zealand asked Kiwis to identify their religion through the question, "What is your religion?" The 2013 census revealed that 2 in 5, or 43%, identify as Christian, whilst almost as many identify as non-religious, 38%. A further 7% adhered to other religions, including Māori Christian, Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, Hinduism, and spiritualism, whilst 12% remained undefined, i.e. not stated, object to answering, don't know, etc. Why have I highlighted the sentence in the middle there? Any ideas? Because when I saw this, I was just about, I wanted to punch somebody. Why would I want to punch somebody? Any ideas? Māori Christians are not Christian in this rendering, this small paragraph. And it's somewhat ironic because the survey itself includes a section on the extent to which New Zealanders have felt that Māori spirituality have influenced New Zealand culture, and particularly our thinking about spirituality and the wider questions. But when it comes to identifying Māori as being Christian and part of the Christian whole, there's something a little bit too difficult about that. I thought that's a really interesting modern take on the kind of problem that we face, I think. What we're going to do tonight, I'm finally getting to tell you what we're going to do tonight, to expand our understanding of the Māori experience of mission, or at least perhaps even what we talk about when we use the word Māori, to expand our understanding also of missionaries, how long it took to get Māori ordained in the system. That's one of the kind of ongoing themes that we do see in this period. 1928, the first Bishop of Aotearoa, Frederick Augustus Bennett. And that's it for moments right now, so just to kind of put a bit of time in there, but we're not going to dwell on that. So our first point, expanding a bit more on what we understand to be Māori and mission. So I think the role of essentialism is really, really huge in our thinking about Māori generally and Māori Christianity in particular. So we have this view sometimes, and I'd like to think that it's a bit subtler these days, but maybe not, of pre-contact, pre-Christian Māori as being pure Māori, as being the real stuff, the authentic Māori. And once contact came, and Christianity arrived, and these two things working in twain, Māori ceased to become real. They're no longer real. They are alloyed. They are, some would have said at the time, degenerate. So this is the kind of language you'll see from Elsden Best, for example. And his influence remains incredibly strong, and I think that idea of, if you want to be really Māori, you have to go back to pre-Christian stuff. If you want to be really Māori, you have to go back to pre-contact stuff. That's incredibly powerful still today, and he was working off the writings of Max Muller, and this pervades so many of Elsden Best's writings, and I think this has a huge effect on us still today. Hirini Ka makes the point that once converted, once the conversion project was underway and even complete, Māori ceased to kind of have their own identity. If they were Christian, they were part of the whole, as long as they stuck to the doctrines. If they putty-puttied around that and played around with that, we'll talk a bit about that more shortly, then they would be rejected as being part of that Christian whole. So either Māori were subsumed or they were ejected from the Christian story in Aotearoa. And expanding on what we mean by missionaries, so we have, I think, this quite maybe disproportionate understanding or thinking, and I'm only speaking generally, of course, of just how many missionaries there were in those early decades in New Zealand. So in 1836, there were 6 European missionaries in the country, and there were no Māori missionaries at that point, by which I mean who were kind of signed up to the CMS agenda. 1844, there were 12 European missionaries. But what we had by this stage was the development of the position of the kaiwhakaako. The kaiwhakaako was a teacher. So we had 295, the estimate is, these aren't exact numbers, 295 kaiwhakaako who would be teaching in Māori communities. And then you see this kind of massive rise in these numbers. So from nothing in 1836 to 1854, we have between 440 and 558 kaiwhakaako, particularly throughout the North Island. So Judith Binney makes this point, as does Hirini Ka, as do a number of other commenters, that Māori agency and how Māori spread the word mattered more in many a real sense than what missionaries actually did, like the European missionaries. So we need to be paying more attention to what was being done in Māori communities by Māori. And often Māori communities would be self-taught, self-evangelised. So this is incredibly important, a very important key to understanding the development of Māori Christianity in New Zealand. And how I'm just... So our understanding of Māori Christianity then tends, I think, in the general narrative, and by general I'm not talking those of us in Māori communities necessarily, but perhaps when we talk a general narrative, we tend to think of the Māori Christian experience as being homogenous. That there were Māori who were converted, Māori who were not converted, that Māori experienced Christianity in a very similar way until they were rejected from the from the Christian narrative. But very much the reality is that Māori experience of Christianity in the 19th century was determined by iwi experiences. So experiencing being Māori in the far north was very different to experiencing being Māori in Tūhoe. Sorry, Christian I should say, in Tūhoe. Very different. Then again, to experiencing being Christian in Raukawa. So the different tribal entities with the different personalities and the role of the kaiwhakaako would be different in each region, which kind of sounds obvious to say, but I just want to, I guess, issue or reissue that warning against thinking of Māori in a very homogenous way. And the second point there, other modes, art, architecture and language, and I've got a couple of slides a bit later on I want to come back to, but we cannot underestimate the flowering of language, art, house building, chapel building, kind of complex building that went on at this time, directly influenced by the rise of Christianity among Māori communities. Incredible period of flowering that I think if we don't pay attention to those phenomena, we miss some very important things about what it has meant to be a Māori Christian in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we have to expand our view of what kind of counts as evidence for what we understand to be Māori Christianity today, judged based on what's happened in the past. So we have to expand on our view of what counts, and I will come back to that because there's a few houses and things that I'd like to mention. But I will come back to that. I wanted to illustrate some of that journey of being Māori and Christian by looking at three particular people who are incredibly important, but there are only three. There are dozens, but I had to choose, so I chose these three. Mere Rikiriki, Wiremu Tamehana, and Kananui Huata, and the reasons why I've chosen these guys will become obvious shortly. So Mere Rikiriki, can I get who's heard of her? I'm not surprised. She was the aunt of Tahupōsiki, yeah, okay, my husband put his hand up. She was the aunt of Tahupōsiki Wiremu Ratana, and she was the most well-known female prophet of the 19th century. In fact, there were other female prophets, but she was the one who gathered the most people to her and had arguably an incredible amount of influence. So she is an incredibly important prophet figure in a period of time in Māori history where the prophetic movement was well underway. So many of you will have heard of that. So between the years of say 1830 and 1920, many leaders came to the fore who had visions, who established religious movements. Many of those movements were based on the Old Testament. So the idea of Māori as Jews wandering in the wilderness, wanting to come back to the land of Canaan or to go to the land of Canaan, the promised land. This was an incredibly powerful image for Māori to latch onto. And that image of Māori as Jews, as the chosen people, was at the root of many of the great Māori prophetic movements. So the development of the Ringatu Church, the development of the Ratana Church, the development even of the Kingitanga. So this prophetic movement, and there's been lots written about the prophetic movement by Bronwyn Ellsmore and Judith Binney and people like that, is also an example of Māori taking Christian messages and Old Testament messages and syncretising them, fusing them with mātauranga Māori, whakaaro Māori, tikanga Māori, and creating something new. So it was along with the house building and the chapel building and the art flowering and the language flowering, there are these movements that are incredibly important as well. And of course, all of these things served to identify Māori in opposition to Pākehā. At the time of the New Zealand Wars, all throughout the country and different conflicts, these ways of creating community, creating connection, creating identity in opposition to those who were in many cases considered to be the enemy, these movements all became very important. So Mere Rikiriki, as I say, best known Māori female prophet of that particular era, she foretold and then anointed her nephew Tahupōsiki Wiremu Ratana to lead his own movement. She also was incredibly influential in Māori Catholic circles. The Maramatanga movement in Māori Catholicism was directly influenced by Mere Rikiriki as well. So she was an incredibly important person that and there are many connections between her and other Māori leaders of other movements. And importantly, she is located at the shift, if you like, between paradigms, between the focus on the Old Testament and the growth and focus on the New Testament and the Gospels in the New Testament. So she's a kind of transcendent figure that kind of straddles both of those things, but shifts the paradigm towards the New Testament. And tomorrow, as a matter of fact, you might have seen this on the news, Ratana has its 100th anniversary, the anniversary of 100 years since Te Hupōtiki Ratana had his vision that he was to establish his movement. And so there are thousands upon thousands of people gathering in Ratana as we speak. So it's kind of, there's a connection between what we're doing here and what they're doing there. They're not on their own, doing their own Māori Christian thing. They are connected to what we're doing here. So also that happened in the middle of the influenza pandemic as well, so an incredibly dangerous time for Māori. Many Māori died in that influenza pandemic, but Ratana and his family were able to escape the worst ravages, in part due to the vision that he had. So the founding of the Ratana Church happened then. I want to mention Wiremu Tamehana because he, no Ngāti Haua, not only because of his kind of religious influence, but because he's probably the most important constitutional theorist, one of the most, I'll grant there may be others, but he's one of the most important constitutional theorists that we've ever had in New Zealand, and very few people in the general sense know very much about him. So Wiremu Tamehana Tarapipi is the person who, he didn't actually conceive of the idea of the kingitanga. That idea came to him from elsewhere, but he pursued the idea of a Māori king movement and the establishment of the notion of a Māori king to work alongside, to be in tandem with the British Crown, and that in turn led to the creation of the kingitanga movement. And in 1858, the first Māori king, Putatau Te Whero, was crowned, and very much in Wiremu Tamehana's view, this was not to be something that was to combat the crown. This was to be something to work alongside so that Māori could have their own king, their own leader who would look after them. And there's very much a welfare idea as well, because so many Māori by this stage were being impoverished. So there's a welfare notion to the king looking after his own children. And saying that in alliance with Queen Victoria and God over both. And in fact, when each time a new monarch is crowned, the Bible is held over the head of the person being crowned, in direct reference to that phrase, God over both. However, this was not well received by the Crown, and in fact by many in the Anglican Church as well, because, missionaries generally, there were all kinds of problems here. I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but for the one. So in 1864, there was supposed to be an engagement at a particular battlefield, and on that particular, which morning was it? It was a date in February. There was the settlement at Rangiaowhia was to have the women and the children there, so that most of the men, the fighting men, would be over at where the engagement was expected to take place in the North Waikato. And the problem is that that's not how the colonial troops played it. A column of 1,230 British troops and their colonial allies marched silently around where the battle was supposed to take place at Paterangi. And they went on to Rangiaowhia, It was a place of refuge, as Vincent O'Malley talks about in his article that he published last year, for women and children. It was an open village, had no fortifications. The men of fighting age were at Paterangi waiting for engagement, and the Kingitanga commanders were there waiting for the engagement that never actually happened. And General Cameron and the troops went into the village. People scattered in all directions because it was unexpected, and there were several people killed, women and children included, in the burning of whare, Raupo whare in that settlement. And we don't know exactly how many people died, but we know that women and children died in that conflagration. Why I've pointed this out, and there's many more things that could be said about it, was because Bishop Selwyn was involved in this event. Now, some have said that he marched in with General Cameron because he was the chaplain for the troops. Others have said, no, we have documentary evidence to say that he stayed back at Tawamutu, but he was still the chaplain of the troops. 9 days prior to this event, he had been warned, he had been sent a letter by Tamihana to say that there are women and children that are at Rangiawhia. Please don't, just let them know that that's where we're going to be keeping the women and children. They were doing this because they'd been advised to do that, kind of carry out that kind of action to keep women and children safe. So they did that. And they were portrayed in the worst possible way. So the role of Bishop Selwyn here is incredibly ambiguous, right? He had spent many, many years developing relationships with Māori, learning the Māori language. He was held in high regard in many respects. But this changed everything. This moment where his ambiguity, the ambiguity of the Anglican Church, was kind of ripped bare for all to see in the involvement of the atrocity that happened at Rangiawhia. So I wanted to kind of make that point because the next person I want to mention, we're skipping to 1960. Because nearly 100 years after this event, the next person I want to mention is Canon Wehuata no Ngāti Kahungunu. Now he may be known to some of you because he was famous for his role as the Padre of the 28 Māori Battalion. And so he was also appointed diocesan missioner of the Anglican Church to the Waikato in 1960. And he was told at the time Bishop Holland appointed him, this is going to be a harder job than the Māori Battalion. And indeed it proved so, because Rangiawhia and the atrocity that happened there was not forgotten. And the church's tacit acceptance of what had happened at Rangiawhia and Bishop Selwyn's involvement, even if he wasn't there on the day, his involvement as being chaplain for those troops was not forgotten. So when Canon Wehuata arrived and they were welcomed, this is how they were greeted. Haere mai, te hahi nāna nei mātou i tau. Welcome. The church that burnt us. How do you create whanaungatanga? How do you create how do you save relationship? How do you recreate relationship that 100 years ago happened so desperately and treacherously ripped asunder? But he stayed for 12 years, I think it was 12 years, and in his quiet way he worked to restore those relationships, and then he went back home and he was missed. He was sorely missed by Waikato when he left in the years before his own death. So the reason I put him there is because he was bearing the burden as Māori and as a Christian for the atrocity that had happened 100 years before and all the things that had gone wrong in the Waikato Crown relationship. And he stayed and he worked and he had to work at that relationship and rebuilding that relationship with the church. And he was as successful, I think, as we could ever have expected. A man of huge mana. My son ripped this off the charger, so I'm worried about the time I've got left on here. Thanks, son. I wanted to just, alongside the story of people, and that's only just a smattering of stories of people and how they've had to kind of negotiate the arrival of the Gospels in New Zealand and the arrival of the Scriptures and create something new. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of the flowering of art. So on the right-hand side we have the Māori Madonna, which was carved. Hang on a sec, I've got that somewhere. It was carved by Pataromu, Tamatea of Tiruvai. It was carved for a new Catholic chapel in the Bay of Plenty. The carver indicated that, you see, I don't know if you can see the detail, but the face is a full facial moko, which is pretty unusual given that this is a female figure, of course, this is Mary. And the face was given the full facial tattoo, or the full facial moko, to denote her spiritual status. However, the non-Māori priest at that particular chapel refused to have it in the building. And indicated that he found it offensive to the church. So just an example there of talking past each other. But nevertheless an intriguing piece of work to kind of express those new understandings of what it means to be Māori and what it means to be Christian. In the middle, I've stole this off the net, so soz, is a picture of the St Michael's Church in Palmerston North, which was built in the shape of a wharenui with all the traditional elements of a wharenui, mahau, maihi, teko, and all kinds of the things we'd usually expect, but actually it's a functioning church. So it's just an example of the kind of fusion of thinking. And in fact, it's primarily used as a liturgy space. It's got pews. Can you move them? I think you can move them. But it's primarily used as a liturgy space. So liturgy kind of is the dominant paradigm within the whare. But it's got it's built as a wharenui, as a wharedunanga in a traditional form. I say traditional form, but the point I made earlier was that, and this is something that Jeff Sissons talks about as well, it's where I got it from actually, is that Māori were not really a housey people up until the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s and beyond. There is archaeological evidence of big houses, or rather larger than normal whare puni presumably, from kind of archaeological digs dating back perhaps to the 13th century. But in terms of Māori having the wharerunanga, the wharenui, the marae ātea, the kind of complex that we're familiar with today, these things developed in the 19th century in response to colonisation, in response to the arrival of Christianity as well. When the Ringatu Church, which was founded by Te Kōti Arikirangi, and then also which had as its head Ruakinana, when that grew, a huge amount of building took place. And so on the left there, you've got a house that was actually built on the east coast, known as Tiruvai. Witi Ihamaira writes about this house because he comes from this area, Waituhi. And it was a house that was built for the arrival of Te Kōti. And you can see that it's painted, and the figures inside are painted, and there's all kinds of mythological and Christian allusion, and within the paintings, and also there's about 8 to 12 houses that were built just because Te Kōti instigated them or inspired them. So it's just an example of this great flowering of creativity that Māori, whereby Māori use these houses for gathering, use these houses for political fermentation, use these houses, all kinds of houses, not just Te Kōti inspired houses, all kinds of great wharenui as ways of reconfiguring the world around them, of recreating Te Ao Māori in this kind of built form. So when we think about being Māori and being Christian, we can't go past the art and the architecture of that period that hasn't ceased, as we can see, with St Michael's in the middle there. I mean, it's not at the same pace, but there are all kinds of interesting things all around the country if you care to look. I just wanted to make this point. This is in the 476 service. So if you're familiar with Anglican liturgy, there is a bilingual service that we use in our churches from page 476 in the prayer book. I might find one around here somewhere. And I just wanted to give you an example of how in the development of the prayer book and in I think it's the 1992 revision, I'm not sure on the year there, but we have reference to Atua Māori in our prayer book. So, no reira, mātou ka tāpai ki a koe, ia mātou whakamoemiti, mō rangi nui I runga nei, mō papatua nuku e takoto nei, mō ngā maunga whakahi, mō ngā puke kōrero, mō ngā taimihi tangata, mō ngā moana e hora nei. And of course you get this kind of anodyne English translation, which cuts out all the Atua Māori. So now we offer our thanks for the beauty of these islands, the wild places and the bush, for the mountains, the coast and the sea. Don't see what we did there. And I've underlined taimihi tangata because that's the phrase that we use to talk about kareri kura o te taiwo wharo, which is my moana, another one of, well, my big moana up in Ahipara, and it's our contribution. This phrase, taimihi tangata, is specific to our people, and Muri Walters writes about, Bishop Muri Walters writes about our contribution being the inclusion of this phrase, taimihi tangata, the tide that greets people. So that has been included, and there's been a lot of inclusion of specific iwi phrases within the Te Reo Māori, within the Reo Māori of the prayer book. So some might say, well, why are we mentioning Papa Tuanuku, the Earth Mother? Why are we mentioning Rangi Nui there? Why are we kind of referring to Atua Māori? There's all kinds of reasons why that might be, but I don't feel a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. And for those of us who are Māori and who are Christian, by and large, we don't have a problem with that. We order our world in such a way that God is at the centre, Christ, we are directed towards Christ, and yet we pay homage to Papa Tuanuku when we stand on the marae Aotea. We pay homage to Rangi Nui. We acknowledge our ancestors when they have passed on. So, for many of us, it's not a difficult thing. But that's a generalisation, perhaps. I just wanted to say, how are we going for time?
We're going great.
Okay, that doesn't tell me much.
I think it seems like we're on track.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to locate myself in this narrative, right? Because I've talked a lot about other people, but now to bring it back to myself. So this is Whangatawatia. I mentioned in my mihi a little mountain. It's not really a mountain. It's not really a mountain. A place called Pukenamu as my mountain. But actually, this is one of my other mountains, Whangatawatia, which is at the base of Ngāti Mile Beach, and it dominates. Are headed on their way up to Te Rerenga Wairua. They hit this maunga, and there's a couple of other things they hit on the way up, and so they go up the beach and they go off at Te Rerenga Wairua. So there's a connection between Whangatawatia and the journey of the spirits as well. This is Te Taiwo Wharo, Kareri Kura. So this is Ngāti Mile Beach, Te Oneroa Atohe, and the moana out there. And the reason I point this out to you is Kareri Kura, or maybe I should say that slightly differently. Kareri Kura. Any ideas what kareri refers to? Very special body of water, kareri. Yeah, Sea of Galilee. So I'll explain that a little bit as to how that kind of comes about. So this connection between the maunga and the moana and the te Onerua Atohe, these things are all interconnected. There's many burial points along te Onerua Atohe where rangatira were buried. So these are sacred parts of the sacred landscape again. And this is the photo that James King took, and I stole it off him because he was up there on a surfing holiday, I think, and I just think that's just not right. Why couldn't I take a photo like that? And here is my iwi marae, one of my marae, not Wainui, which I referenced before. This is te ohaki. Te ohaki is a word referring to the last will, and the living will, the last breath, the last saying of a person before they die. So te ohaki is named after Pōroa, who died in about 1830, who was the paramount chief of Te Rarawa at the time. And so this house was built in memory of his ohaki. And I want to show you a close-up of the the window here. I really love this. It's one of my favourite things in all the world. This window at the top, I don't know if you can see, but it's got little kiore, rats, mice, kind of scattered around the edge. And the guy at the top is Ruanui, who was the captain of the Māmari Waka. So when they landed, right, the rats all hopped off, and that's so it's a nice, neat little image. But in the centre there, you've got the ohaki of Pōroa. And it says, kia u ki te whakapono, kia aroha tētahi ki tētahi. So hold fast. Now I'm going to translate this as to the faith. Love one another. Kia aroha tētahi ki tētahi appears in the Māori translation of the Bible in Galatians and also in John. And when I see this whakatauki translated, and there's many of my whānau who would say that this is not a Christian thing, absolutely determined to say it's not a Christian thing. But this phrase, te whakapono, we know by the 1840s, te whakapono was being used to mean the faith, the Christian faith. Pōroa died in 1830. He was not a Christian when he died. He was never baptised. So I'm probably going against the wishes of my whānau when I say I see this as being reference to the command that Jesus gave to love one another as I have loved you. But like I say, I'm probably buying a fight there, so I'll leave it there. But that is the ohaki that marae is built to, or that wharenui is built to uphold. And Pōroa, when he died in 1830, he was succeeded by Pana Kariao, who was a Christian himself. He did get baptised, and he went on to be the paramount chief of Te Rarawa for another 40 years. So there's a huge Christian influence in this area. And we know this anyway if we've got any kind of vague understanding of the development of Christianity in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then just to carry on with our tour of this sacred landscape, this is off Roma Road, so Te Ohaki, Roma, Rome, right? Yeah. So this is all on Roma Road, right? All roads lead to Rome, right? And these are two of the churches that you see on that road. So on the right is St Clement's, which is up a hill and is an little Anglican church. And then almost directly across the road from that is the Ratana Church. So there is this kind of embodiment in the soil and in the built spaces also of this little settlement, this kind of Christian sacred space, specifically Christian sacred space, a Māori Christian sacred space that you cannot divorce from the landscape, from the moana, from the maunga, and from the beach itself and all the other, there's all kinds of other things that go on there. But just in case you're feeling like, all romantic and bucolic and things like that. This is where I grew up. So I like this shot because it shows Robert Godley. It's Robert Godley, isn't it? The founder of Canterbury. And in 1983, when Prince Charles and Lady Di visited Christchurch, I was standing on that statue. I was 13 and I got to shake the hand of Prince Charles. I did not wash my hand for a week. But I thought I'd just tell you that because being Māori has not been something that has been kind of essentialised in me. I've had to learn that over the course of my getting longer life. And in 1983, when I was shaking Prince Charles's hand, did I understand or did I know about the sacred landscape that my father's people came from? No, I did not. I'd been there once at the age of 7 and I hated it. But I'm not going to be self-flagellating about being a child of the urban migrations, right? My journey to faith took place after my journey to being Māori. So I've had to combine those things. So those last slides are just a way of showing you how I have to locate my whakaaro and my Christian identity and my Māori identity. It's not just in those places. I take it with me everywhere. But for those of us who are Māori and Christian, we have often got to site ourselves, to locate ourselves in a landscape that has a particular, often sacred overlay or sacred essence about it. We're not, I think, yes, that's it. But I'm more than happy to take questions.
Let's get our hand first.